Hello, and welcome to our webinar, Clearing the Path, Tackling America's Visa Backlog, from the Bipartisan Policy Center, the place where democracy gets to work. I'm Teresa Cardinal Brown. I'm a senior advisor for immigration and border policy here at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and we are very happy that you have joined us. While a lot of attention has been recently focused at the US-Mexico border, the process by which foreign nationals gain permanent residence in the United States, the coveted green card, has been slowly grinding to a halt. Millions of would-be immigrants are waiting in growing backlogs, either outside the United States or while in temporary status inside the United States. And those backlogs can mean waits of a decade or more. This is causing real challenges for immigrants, their families, their employers, and our country. Today, BPC is releasing our report, Green Light to Growth, the Economic Benefits of Clearing Green Card Backlogs. And we'll be discussing this report with its author, Jack Malde, and then continue the conversation with a great panel of experts. You can join this conversation by submitting a question in the comment function of YouTube if you're watching there, or you can also submit a question via Twitter, or X as it's called now, by using the hashtag BPCLive. And we will take some of those questions and answer them live at the end of this program. So to get us started, let me introduce the report's author, Jack Malde. Jack is a senior policy analyst within BPC's Economic Policy Project, and he works on immigration and workforce issues. Before joining BPC, Jack was a senior economist at the Confederation of British Industry, and you'll hear his accent the minute he begins speaking. Yes, he's a Londoner. But he's been working with economic projects and is an economist by trade. He worked closely with the policy teams at that institution to help provide evidence for their policy work, and he's doing the same here at BPC. He holds a master's degree in economics with distinction from the University College of London, and his undergraduate degree is from Cambridge University. So Jack, glad to have you here with us.
Thank you for having me.
So let's get started and talking about this report. Can you start by just giving an overview of why BPC did this report and the objectives we had in doing it?
Yeah, absolutely. So we know that the human costs of the green card backlogs are pretty well documented. So Teresa, you mentioned that many people are having to wait decades to receive their green cards. And we know that key roles are going unfilled in areas such as healthcare and national security. What we wanted to do with this report was to emphasize that there are also considerable economic costs associated with the green card backlogs. And we wanted to put a number on this using quite a rigorous economic methodology. And the hope really is that we can evidence the significant economic prize that's on offer if we were to deal with this problem, and to really underline the imperative for Congress and others to act on this issue.
So what were the key findings of the report, and what were the drivers of those findings?
Yeah, sure. So just to clarify the backlogs that we're looking at. So we're looking at both employment and family-based green card backlogs, which we estimate in the report to comprise of roughly 7.6 million individuals. And our central estimate is that if we were to hypothetically clear these backlogs in the next year, that we would see roughly $3.9 trillion of GDP gains over the next 10 years. So that's a really significant economic boost that's on offer. And just to explain a little bit about why we would see that gain. So it's important to understand, as you mentioned, that within the backlog, there are people outside of the country, but also people inside the country. And those people outside of the country, if they receive their green cards, that allows them to enter the United States, bringing skills and knowledge that increases our productivity, but also filling workforce vacancies. So we have a lot of shortages at the moment, and they're only getting worse as our population ages. So that's one key channel, enabling people to enter the country. The other key channel is through adjustments of status. So you mentioned that there are people currently inside the United States who are in the backlog on temporary status. If these people receive their green cards, that allows them to adjust to permanent status. And the relevance of this is that if you're in the backlog on temporary status, there are restrictions on the jobs that you can take. So when these people adjust to permanent status, these restrictions largely fall away. People can take the jobs that they're most suited for, and there's another productivity boost from that. I just want to say another key finding from the report is that the vast majority of the benefit that we estimate is from the new entrants, with roughly 99% of the benefit coming from that. But that's not, with that having been said, there's still a very significant economic boost from those adjustments of status as well.
So you talked about the national benefits, but is there difference in where in the country those benefits are felt and how they are felt?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the report, we estimate the geographic distribution of the benefits throughout the United States. And we do find that every single state benefits to some extent from clearing the backlogs. However, we do find that there are some states that benefit more. And unsurprisingly, these are the states that tend to get the most immigration. So, for example, the state that benefits the most is California, with roughly 19% of the total benefit. This is followed by New York with 13%, Florida with 11%, Texas with 10%, and New Jersey with 6%. So these are the 5 states with the largest immigrant populations. Something we do discuss in the report is that it is possible to spread these benefits throughout the United States more evenly. So one way of doing that is through state-based visas, which would essentially give states the opportunity to encourage immigrants to come to their state to fulfill the economic needs that they have. So that's a really interesting policy implication of our report, is that we can really use state-based visas to distribute benefits more widely.
So that's one of the policy implications. What are some of the other policy implications from the report?
Yeah, so to explain that, I will quickly explain 2 different types of backlogs that we're considering. So firstly, we have these cap-based backlogs. These exist because of the annual green card limits that are set in law. And routinely, there are more people sponsored for green cards than these limits allow. And these people then have to join the backlog and essentially wait for a green card to become available. So that's the cap-based backlog. And to deal with that, the most effective thing that can be done is for Congress to raise green card limits. These limits have been in place for decades. They haven't been updated for decades, and they're really not fit for purpose anymore. So we need Congress to act to raise these limits. The other type of backlog that we're considering is the processing backlog. So these are applications that have not yet been processed because of a lack of resources. So the other policy implication in our report is that there needs to be more resources. There needs to be more funding, more staff, and more efficient processes to process these applications. And that, again, could be an act of Congress to appropriate more money. I would say quickly that we do estimate that 71% of the benefit would come from clearing cap-based backlogs. So that is just a really important finding that underlines the imperative to raise the green card limits.
All right, so that's an overview of the report, and we can get into some more details, and I'm sure we will, but I want to bring in the rest of our panel now, and let me do a quick set of introductions. So first we have Madeline Zavodny. Madeline is a professor of economics at the University of North Florida, where she's been since the fall of 2017. In addition to being a professor at UNF, she's a research fellow at the Institute of Labor Economics, otherwise known by the initials IZA, a fellow at the Global Labor Organization, and an adjunct scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. She focuses her research on the economics of immigration, so I'm sure she has thoughts about this report. She's widely published in academic journals and has also authored 2 books. She has a PhD in economics from MIT, and before joining UNF, she was a professor at Angus Scott College and Occidental College, and an economist with the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta and of Dallas. Our next panelist is Eleanor Pelta. Eleanor is a partner and co-leader of the immigration practice at Morgan Lewis, an international law firm, where she supports the firm's clients in understanding and complying with immigration laws regarding the hire and retention of foreign talent. Throughout her career, she has worked on many different aspects of immigration law and policy. She's a past president of the American Immigration Lawyers Association and a recipient of the association's Edith Lowenstein Award for Excellence in Advancing the Practice of Immigration Law. She received her undergraduate degree from Princeton and her JD from Harvard Law School. So we welcome Eleanor. And last but not least, Daniel DiMartino. Daniel is a PhD candidate in economics at Columbia University and a graduate fellow at the Manhattan Institute in New York, where he writes and focuses on high-skill immigration policy. Born and raised in Venezuela, Daniel immigrated to the United States in 2016. In addition to his work on immigration, he is an advocate against the socialist policies of his homeland and a founder of the Dissident Project. Daniel's appeared on Fox News and CNN, written for USA Today. You can find Daniel in a lot of different places. He's a regular speaker on college campuses and events across the country. And he has received fellowships from the Institute for Humane Studies and the Job Creators Network. So welcome to all of our panelists. So Madeline, I'm going to start with you. Jack gave a real quick overview of the report, and to our viewers, the report is available on our website. If you go to bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration, you'll be able to find it, and a link will also be placed in the comment area of YouTube. But Madeline, since you've done a lot of research on the economics of immigration, what did you think of the report, and how does it line up with your own research? Do you think our estimate of the GDP gains is too high, too low, or in that Goldilocks just about right zone?
Thanks for having me, first of all, Teresa, and congratulations to Jack and the Bipartisan Policy Center for an excellent report. I really enjoyed reading it, and I encourage anyone who watches this, either live or later, to go download it and read it. And in particular, what I hope is that policymakers and their staffers are going to read it in order to understand the tremendous economic benefits that we can get from clearing the backlog in the green card queue, but also more generally, just the economic benefits of encouraging immigration to the United States. I think this is a topic that just doesn't receive enough attention at all. So I think that the estimate in the report, 3.6 billion, it's jaw-dropping, right? It's really big, but it's probably correct, right? And there are error bands around it, but any way you kind of slice and dice it, there are tremendous economic gains associated with admitting more immigrants and with allowing some of those who are already here on temporary visas to become green card holders, and eventually, if they want, U.S. citizens. So you could think about, why are there such huge gains? So one part of it, as Jack talked about, is the people who are already here in the United States on temporary visas. Particularly, the report only focuses on those who are on H-1B skilled visas. And the backlog for some of those people, particularly those from India, to get a green card is tremendously long, right? Some of them are going to wait decades. And while they're waiting, it's harder for them to switch jobs. They can't start their own businesses. In some cases, their spouses can't work. Their children are aging out of the system because once the children turn 21, they no longer can be a dependent of their parents' visa status, basically. And so allowing them to adjust status creates lots of economic benefits for those immigrants, for their families, for their employers, and for the broader economy. Then there's the other side, which is the economic benefits of admitting people who are overseas waiting for a visa to become available for them. And we can talk later about, exactly where all of those benefits come from. But as Jack talked about, this is really where the large economic benefits, not just to those immigrants, but to the United States as a whole, come from. They're huge, with good reason.
So Eleanor, let me turn to you. You've been working in immigration a long time. How have these backlogs changed during the course of your time working in immigration? I mean, we're talking about decades-long waits in certain circumstances. Has it always been this way, or is this kind of a relatively recent phenomenon?
The cap-based backlogs have been very bad for a long time. We have 140,000 employment-based immigrant visas available every fiscal year. My practice is mainly a business practice. We represent businesses, both multinational businesses and US-based businesses, and so we represent their employees as well. And so this is something that we have lived with as long as I can remember, I mean, the immigration laws have not been meaningfully touched since 1990, really. The processing backlogs have just gotten more egregious year over year. During the last administration, where there were really affirmative challenges placed and pressures placed on the adjustment of status process, those really caused some processes to really come to a grinding halt. And really, those backlogs, while the current administration, I think, is trying very much to implement policies to make those processes go faster, they have not succeeded in clearing out backlogs caused under the last administration. And they really haven't, I think, taken a critical look at the adjustment of status process to find efficiencies, find ways so that huge stacks of paper don't sit in a U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services office, district office, or regional office, for months and months and months without being touched or reviewed. So really over the past, I would say, 8 to 10 years, the processing backlogs have really worsened measurably.
So Daniel, you recently wrote an article for the Manhattan Institute with some proposals for dealing with some of these backlogs. Tell us about what you're recommending and why.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. Well, something we need to understand is that the growth in the processing backlog is not new. It's not because of the pandemic. It's not even just because of policies of the Trump administration. The processing backlog has been growing at least in a full speed since the Obama administration, at the beginning of the Obama administration. It continued to grow under the Trump administration, and it's continued to grow under the Biden administration. So with the latest numbers from USCIS, the total number of pending forms that have not been decided has reached more than 8.9 million in the third quarter of 2023 fiscal year. We will soon get the fourth quarter numbers. I'm expecting over 9 million. At the beginning of the Biden administration, it was less than 7 million. So that means that, the backlog keeps growing. A lot of this backlog is not just, of course, the green card petitions, which is a huge portion, but it's also even employment authorization forms. And what we have to understand, and where my solutions get to, is all of these different backlogs of legal immigration applications are related to each other, because USCIS is one agency and they have to distribute the resources. Am I going to approve this employment authorization card request, or am I going to approve this adjustment of status request, or am I going to approve this family petition or this employer petition? And so the problem is that USCIS does not have enough staff, and they also keep increasing the time they take to review each form. And so my main solution is that we need to expand a service called premium processing. This allows immigrants or any petitioner, if it's an American or an employer, to pay an extra fee to USCIS that will allow them to get a response within a time frame, usually 30 or 45 days. The good thing about it is that it's the only tool legally that we have right now to bound processing times under the law. USCIS is required to respond to you if they have all the evidence that you requested, or they have to refund your fee, which they don't want to do. And some people are concerned, well, but then how are they going to do this fast? You're just going to put some people ahead of the line from others. Well, the reality is that you're going to give them so many more resources. And I estimated how much we will need to charge for each of these forms. And we can indeed expand premium processing gradually over the next few years, such that we would end in less than a decade all the processing backlogs at USCIS.
Okay, so we're talking about resources. We talked about the green card numbers and the CAP backlog. Jack, I'm going to bring it back to you. when we did this report, you and I had a bunch of conversations, I know, about what we could count and what we couldn't count, and where we had to kind of make some educated guesses or assumptions. And Madeline sort of referenced some of that, but can you talk a little bit about some of the assumptions that we made in coming up with the overall estimates that we have of the economic benefits?
Yeah, sure. So, as economists, we have to make assumptions. One of the key assumptions we make is that we would clear these backlogs in the next year, and then we're estimating the economic benefit over the next 10 years. Now, obviously, it's a tough task to clear the entire backlog within 1 year, and we don't think that's likely to happen. But this is a simplifying assumption we made so that we can really understand the size of the prize. And in reality, as Daniel mentioned, policies are likely to erode the backlog over time. But still, this assumption allowed us to understand, what is the benefit that we can achieve by clearing the current backlog. And just one other assumption that we've made that I want to point out. We've essentially had to make the assumption that different types of immigrant would have the same economic benefit. So employment-based immigrants and family-based immigrants would have the same economic benefit. And this is because there's a lack of research on the economic benefits that enabling different types of immigration would have. So this is an assumption we had to make. And I think, further research would be really welcome. And it might be the case, for example, that employment-based immigrants that have generally very high skill levels would have even greater economic benefits. So yeah, we've had to make some assumptions, and we'd actually love for other organizations to build on our research and do some more in-depth research that follows on from our report. But yes, we've made some assumptions, and I think we've also been quite conservative in the report. So it's quite possible that the benefits are larger than what we've estimated. For example, if you were to raise green card limits, that would clear not just current backlogs, but also future backlogs. So our report focuses on the current backlog, and certain policies might have much greater benefits if they reduce future backlogs as well.
So Madeline, one of the things that Jack is referencing is that to get to that next level of differentiation between the skill levels of immigrants, and we should point out that our immigration system, about 60% of all the green cards that are issued in a given year are based on family relationships. Less than 17% are based on employment relationships, but the skill levels can vary in both groups, right? So family members may come and they may be PhDs or they may have a high school education. And the employment based is divided by skill level as well. We just didn't have the granularity to kind of be able to dig deep in there. But some of your research, and I think you're aware of other research that maybe has looked at those differentiators. Can you talk a little bit about the components of sort of economic benefit that we can look at and the ways we can look at it?
Sure. So I absolutely agree with Jack. We always want more data. Please, more data. Always great. But what we know is that the biggest economic gains tend to come from having immigrants who are not like the people already here. So what that can mean, surprisingly perhaps to people, is that low educated immigrants who haven't even finished high school, can have big economic benefits for the economy as a whole, because that's a group that's in relatively short supply in the United States. We're a very advanced economy. Most people here finish high school, a lot are even able to go on to college. So there are large economic benefits coming from what we might consider low-skilled immigrants who do have skills. They make economic contributions. And in turn, having more low-skilled or less educated immigrants has positive spillovers onto other groups who are already here, be they U.S. natives or earlier immigrants. Childcare, home health care workers, having all of these types of workers in our economy who again might be considered low-skilled, helps other people work and support their families. So there are these big positive economic spillovers. And this is really what the report, a lot of the economic gains here are are coming from these productivity increases, it's not just having more immigrant workers that grows the economy. It's having more workers allows people who are already here to benefit, specialize a little bit more. And then we get entrepreneurship and innovation and all of these other things that hopefully we'll come back to in a little bit.
Eleanor, I want to come back around to you. So you talked a little bit about the impact to your clients, the companies, the workers, their families when these backlogs have grown. Can you tell us a little more about, like, what does it actually mean? Take us through maybe some of your cases, and you can talk about the choices that have to be made either by an employer or an employee when they're stuck for a long time in these backlogs.
Sure. Well, if you have a person, let's say, working at one of my clients, a pharmaceutical company, we see actually a lot of recruitment of foreign clinical statisticians, for example, and people with quantitative backgrounds to do, for example, to work on studies or create modeling or software programs for capturing data in connection with developing drugs. And that's very important work. And when you have somebody from a backlogged country, and they typically come in initially, often they will come in as a foreign student. They might be recruited by an employer. Then they have to go into the H-1B lottery. That is another source of tremendous anxiety for my employer and employee clients, because the demand for H-1Bs is very high, and the amount is limited by Congress to a total of 85,000 new H-1Bs a year. So first you have to get selected in the H-1B lottery. And then if your employer is happy with your performance and you are happy at your employer, typically what happens is the employer undertakes an employment-based green card process for you. And the first step of that is generally a labor market test called a PERM. It's done through the Department of Labor, and it's to show that you are not displacing a qualified U.S. worker in taking a permanent job with your employer. And then the next stage is an immigrant visa based on that labor market test. And then you kind of can't move. You can't do anything if you're backlogged after you have your approved immigrant visa until you're at the head of the backlog queue. And the backlog is behind you and you're up front, and then you can finish the green card process. So all that time, while you have an approved immigrant visa, you are kind of a bit frozen professionally. If you move to another employer, if you move to a substantially different job with the same employer, if you move to a different geographic area, the employer must start that labor cert process for you all over again, so that by the time you're ready, you are in the job that you're supposed to have at the time that you file your final green card paperwork, your adjustment of status. All of the laws about job mobility during the green card process really have to do with that last stage of the green card process, which you cannot get to if you're backlogged. So you might not be working in the job that it makes the most sense for you to be working at, based on your employer's need for somebody of your experience and your ability, and also based on, your skills and your background and the experience that you've gotten in your prior jobs. You may decide, I'm just going to stay where I am professionally, because I don't want to have to start the process all over again Um, and and so it could be many years that you're kind of frozen in this job. At the same time, you may have children that are aging out. As Madeline mentioned, if you have a child who reaches 21 and you don't have an adjustment of status filed because you're in backlog, that child will not be included in your employment-based process. And so there is another spot where either we're losing possibly a talented, skilled person who might be going abroad, or that person may have to get their own visa to study, maybe get their own H-1B, and there goes another person who's in the backlog. So these are the types of things that I see in my practice. And that's just from a processing standpoint. You kind of can't quantify, the anxiety that people bring with them every day to the workplace because they're worried about their immigration process. They're worried about their ability to stay in the United States on a permanent basis. And when, in fact, what their employers want is for them to come into the workplace and focus on their jobs.
Yeah. I want to ask you one more question because, this is not this is part of the immigration law the way it was written, right? It was written to say you have a permanent employment-based green card is based on a job with an employer. And my guess is that at the time these things were put together, nobody thought that the time between you starting that process and ending that process would be 30 years, which it could be if for somebody who's starting now. Is that so now we kind of come to this point where the law and how it actually works in practice are kind of far removed for how it was designed in the first place. You're obviously talking to employers and their workers. Do they understand that this is just, or they just get frustrated that really this is how the law is designed?
Well, I have to tell them that it's a little bit of an Alice in Wonderland situation that's kind of divorced from our 21st century, economy. What you say is absolutely correct. First, you have to remember that the labor certification part of the process, which I described, is based on one sentence in the Immigration and Nationality Act, one sentence. So the Department of Labor does have some ability to go back, look at the process that they have put in place, that flows from this one sentence and make, think about what changes could be made without having to go to Congress to get the law changed. So that's one thing that could be done. The other thing to remember is that the labor certification process, when it was invented, actually only related to people waiting abroad. And it was only in the 1990s when dual intent for H-1B workers, and that's pretty technical, but H-1B workers were allowed to come in the United States, have the intention to work temporarily for their employer, but also have a more long-term intention to get a green card. At that time, we saw really the process shift to where the perm labor certification process is really done now for people who are already working in the United States. But the process didn't change. So there really does have to be a change in the process, and it either has to be done through Congress or through, some very smart people at the Department of Labor thinking about what they can do from a regulatory perspective to really bring the labor cert process up to where we need it to be today to kind of help alleviate some of these problems.
Daniel, I want to talk to you about something else that you wrote about, and that is this idea that even though we have these long backlogs, when there have been years when we haven't issued all the green cards that we could in a given year, and so we lose them. And I know you've looked at it and other people have, there's been a couple of bills to recapture, quote unquote, these lost green cards. Do you see that as a solution? Do you think more needs to be done beyond that?
Yeah, well, several things. One, the Manhattan Institute, I'm coming up with them with proposed model legislation that's going to come out next week, by the way, so you guys are finding out first, that would change the green card spillover formula, which was written, I think, in a way that they didn't understand what would happen with the numbers, like just simply an error in the Immigration and Nationality Act. That means that every time the Department of State and USCIS don't issue all the immigrant visas available in the employment-based category, they are lost. And so what my model legislation does is that those are left inside the employment-based category for following years. And also, if we over issue visas, which has happened actually in a few years, those are subtracted and they're not overused. They're subtracted and only from the family-based category, with the goal of shifting some green cards away from family and into employment, which tend to be people with higher levels of education and productivity. And I think Madeleine said that all the immigrants complement the native-born workers, and it's not just about having more workers, but having people that are different from native-born. But I think there's also a flip side here, right? Obviously, there are benefits to complementarity. There are benefits to having just more workers in general, but people retire, and surely you're going to get a new worker in the United States if you let in a 55-year-old who retires at 65. So the 10-year GDP effect and fiscal effect is going to be positive, but their actual lifetime fiscal effect is going to be extremely negative because they're going to get a green card and therefore collect Social Security and Medicare once they reach retirement age. And so I think this is something that we need to be concerned of, because the immigrant flow to the United States is increasingly old. And as a consequence, we are not maximizing the economic benefits of immigration, which can only be done if we're letting more educated and younger people into the United States. Also on the point of simplifying the processes, some of the solutions I proposed in my Manhattan Institute report deal that surely we need premium processing, we need more resources at USCIS, but we also need to stop asking migrants to file forms they don't need. Most work permit requests can be completely phased out. For example, international students who want to request optional practical training, OPT, they have to request an employment authorization document. But if they are doing CPT during school and they're still working for an external employer, they don't need to. They can just use a signature in their I-20 form. Why don't we do the same for OPT? That would save us hundreds of thousands of employment authorization requests each year. So, it's this kind of quick changes. The Department of Labor, too, it's only based on one sentence. We can have the Department of Labor exempt vast swaths of the highly skilled immigrant population from even filing PERM or prevailing wage requests if they have a minimum salary. These are all things that we're able to do without congressional action. And so I think that the executive needs to be bolder in the simplification measures so that we can accelerate and high school migration and reduce the processing backlogs.
Yeah. So Daniel, you called on Madeline a little bit, so I'll ask Madeline if she wants to come back and respond a little bit. But I do want to mention another report that BPC, actually another blog that Jack wrote that we put out yesterday. We did a large survey of people who are not in the labor force right now, not currently looking for work, asking why. And we found that for many of them, the two largest reasons why they're not currently looking for work, if they're in prime working age, 25 to 54, is because of either personal disability or illness issues or caregiving. So Madeline, you said something earlier that sometimes immigrants taking some of these jobs like direct care might help Americans be more productive in the workforce. To Daniel's point, people who come in with higher skills may be more productive individually. How do you see these things balancing out on the macro level?
Well, I think both are important. And I think high-skilled immigrants, the doctors, the scientists, the engineers, they get more attention. And I think that they are easier for people to understand, oh, here's the economic benefits from having these highly educated, high-skilled workers. But we need workers all across the spectrum. And coming out of the pandemic, the labor shortages that we've seen, I think have brought this home to many Americans in a way that they haven't before. And boy, do we need construction workers across the country as well. But speaking of high-skilled and all of this discussion of perm, I love all of these ideas that Daniel had about ways that the executive branch could simplify the process and streamline it a little bit. So I want to ask Eleanor now about one of the things that the Biden administration has proposed. I'm not a lawyer. I don't even play one on TV, so I don't understand this stuff. Explain Schedule A to us in this AI, kind of adding AI jobs onto it and what that could do, please.
You're up.
Okay, thank you. A great question, Madeline. So the White House issued the other day an executive order relating to AI. And as part of that executive order, it instructed the Department of Labor to look to basically open up for comment whether Schedule A could be expanded to not just AI related jobs, but basically STEM jobs. Schedule A is refers to essentially a list of jobs designated by the Department of Labor to be in shortage. And you can essentially, as Daniel said, bypass the labor certification process because the Department of Labor doesn't have to determine one by one whether jobs in those occupations are going to displace U.S. workers because they already know there are not enough of those types of people to do those jobs. So in Schedule A now, you have jobs like physical therapists, et cetera, that are known to be shortage occupations. And so you can skip the labor cert process. So the executive order basically asked the Department of Labor to do a rulemaking and get input from the public as to what jobs in both AI and more broadly in STEM might be in shortage that could be added to Schedule A. Now, I will say, and I'm very excited about this because it could be a way of streamlining and really achieving another goal of this administration, which is to find ways to both attract more people in STEM jobs and also keep more people here who have STEM degrees. And granted, those aren't, as you said, we also need construction workers and caregivers. So we don't just need STEM workers, but we know we do need STEM workers. So this is, I think, a great way of doing that. I will say that many, many years ago, there was something called the Labor Market Pilot Program, where Congress asked the Department of Labor to do something very similar and come up with a list of jobs that they thought were in shortage, where the labor certification would not be needed, and kind of nothing came of that. So I'm hoping that really this is an initiative that has some wheels and takes off. I did see today that the Department of Labor is getting ready to issue a rule inviting public comment on this. So I think they are quite motivated to try to expand Schedule A, and it would be great.
So one question I have, and before I ask the question, I just want to remind our viewers, if you're in YouTube, please put your questions in the chat, and you can also put them in X using the hashtag BPC Live. So we have a little bit of questions that can have waiting for us when we're ready to ask those. But Eleanor, just with regard to Schedule A, that's the first part of the process, and the way you describe the process, that might be faster to get to the second part of the process, but you still have that long wait at the end. So would that help with the kind of backlogs that Jack was talking about, or just sort of some of them and not the others?
I think it would help with some of them. Right now, it takes really 24 months from start of a perm process to actually having a certified perm in your hand. And it's expensive. So if certain jobs were on Schedule A and employers did not have to go through the entire perm process and go through a labor market test, first of all, it would really be much less expensive for employers. It also might take away some of that hesitation of employees to move to a different job, because if the job is in, another STEM field that's on Schedule A, then it becomes kind of easier to do a new application, or perhaps the Department of Labor could think of a way where you wouldn't have to do that. You could be mobile from one type of Schedule A job to another. I mean, they certainly could build that into the system if they wanted to, I think, by regulation. So it does alleviate some of the problem. It does not alleviate the problem caused by the fact that we don't have enough numbers. That they're really, it's Congress that has to address that. There's kind of no way around that. Perhaps there are some ways that could be explored where an adjustment of status could be filed before somebody's priority date is current, meaning before they come to the start of the line. But under statute, the green card can't be granted until a visa number is available. And so you do still face the problems with the backlog, the aging out problems, the many, many years wait. And again, I mean, the wait, that also means that you're waiting to become a US citizen as well, because you can't start the 5-year period required for citizenship until you have that green card in your hand. And yes, so we're not realizing the benefits of permanent immigration to the United States until somebody has that green card.
Yeah. So Jack, I want to bring you back in. At the end of the report, we do mention a couple of pieces of legislation that have been introduced that might deal with some of these backlogs. Can you just talk about them? Because obviously, one half of this is resources, right, for USCIS or State Department if they're processing visas overseas. And from listening to Eleanor, I think Department of Labor needs more resources to do these perms as well. But Congress needs to deal with the caps. So what kinds of things has Congress looked at?
Yeah, I completely agree with what Eleanor was saying. We need Congress to act. There's limited authority within the executive branch. The Schedule A changes are very welcome, but we do need Congress to act. And fortunately, we are seeing some bipartisan attempts. Earlier this year, we saw the Dignity Act of 2023 was introduced in the House of Representatives by Representatives Salazar and Escobar. And this is a comprehensive immigration reform bill. It does include a lot of legal immigration reform, and in particular, relevant to the green card backlogs, the Dignity Act would raise the country caps. So at the moment, the law says that no one country can have more than 7% of the total green card allowance. And the Dignity Act would raise this to 15%. So that's a really impactful change. And I would say the problem with the country cap is that every country has the same allowance, but some countries have a lot more people and have a lot more people wanting to come and work in the United States and contribute to our economy. So India, for example, has a lot of people who are being sponsored for green cards. And the fact that they get the same allowance as every other country means that there are many, many people who have to wait decades for their green cards from India, and many, many people who are actually going to die before they receive their green cards. So we absolutely do need Congress to act on this issue. And it's great to see the bipartisan effort of the Dignity Act of 2023. And I will say as well that effort is getting some traction. We're seeing more co-sponsors every week for that bill. So that's great to see.
Daniel, did you have some other ideas about things that Congress can do?
Yeah, I think that there's also an over focus on the per country caps, because, if you see what Congressional Research Service has estimated would happen if you just eliminated the per country caps. On the family-based backlog, really not much. I mean, some people will go from waiting 15 to 10, others from 5 to 10, it's still too many years. But really the big change is in the employment-based category, in which Indians now would probably die in wait for a green card if they apply today on the EB2 or EB3 categories, and perhaps in the EB1 very soon. But everybody else would go from waiting 0 to waiting 30 years, while the Indians will go from waiting 100 to waiting 30, which is still unacceptable. So in reality, changing the per country caps will not meaningfully change the life of Indians who are employer sponsored today. It will benefit people who are already here for 20 years, for maybe a couple 100,000. But for future immigrants, it would not change the picture, and it would make it worse for people from other countries. So what we really need to do is, perhaps eliminate the cap on EB1, perhaps eliminate the cap on EB2 national interest waiver, which really, we're not talking about big numbers. We're talking about maybe up to 100,000 more immigrants a year on the employment-based category, which is the highest skilled, which is, people who are usually physicians who are going to pay much more in taxes than they're going to receive in government benefits, who may even save lives, innovate, more likely, and own companies. And so, I'm concerned that we're putting the focus where it shouldn't be. We need to update the caps for the employment-based category, or completely change how the green card system works. Maybe we don't need these categories. Maybe we need to have a system more like Canada's, right? Where only the immediate relatives are exempt from caps. And then you have everybody else competing in the same level playing field based on points and skills. And there's no backlog because you're either in or you're out.
Yeah, I will just say that I think, one of the things that we see sometimes in legislation that Congress puts forward is we've not been successful in getting big comprehensive immigration law passed, or big ideas like eliminating green card caps. So this is like, okay, well, if we can't increase the overall green cards, maybe we can tweak around the edges how they're allocated. But as you said, at the point we are right now, the backlogs are so large that tweaking around the edges is one, it's going to hurt other people who may not have such a weight now, and it's not necessarily going to answer the bigger questions. We did put out a report earlier this year just looking at America's demographics and the aging of our population. And not us, but the Congressional Budget Office had said that by 2042, deaths will exceed births in the United States. And so if we're going to have any population growth after that, it's got to come from immigrants and their descendants. So we have to think, we're talking about the economic benefits of clearing out backlog, but what we're really trying to get at is, we're facing some hard choices, I think, as a country. And Daniel, you talked a lot about the fiscal impacts on Social Security. A plug for BPC's fiscal policy work that's looking at how we do a better job of balancing those things out. But at the end of the day, a growing economy can support a growing number of people and the government services they attract. So we have to look at all of these things together. We did have a couple of questions from the backlog, one of which related not to the employment-based or family-based backlogs, but to other groups of people who are waiting to come in. In this case, we're talking about folks who are waiting on refugee status, or the Afghan folks that are waiting overseas. These are other groups of immigrants that are coming not just because they might be benefiting our economy, but because they're fleeing terrible circumstances. And yet Congress is kind of stuck on that as well. I would just ask any of our panelists if you have comments on sort of the benefits that refugees can bring to our economy, and why there may be other reasons that we should look to see how we can extend that. I saw, Daniel, you had kind of waved, so I'll let you go first.
Yes. Well, something we need to understand of how the processing works and why these people are waiting is that the humanitarian free services that are done through the, asylum, or even the special immigrant visas that are processed by USCIS are all funded by the immigrants who do pay fees, usually the employment-based and family-based ones. And so solving that backlog by bringing in more resources to USCIS, by reducing, the forms that we need to file, by expanding premium processing, but that's actually going to help also the Afghans outside. That's also going to help the asylum seekers here get their cases decided faster. And so this is why these topics intertwine and matter.
Yeah. Anyone else want to tackle that? Madeline, go ahead.
And also, historically, the U.S. experience has been that refugees are at least as good, if you will, as all other types of immigrants. They're not really indistinguishable in the long run. They assimilate, they learn English, their kids are just like the rest of us, and so on. So we should welcome refugees. And I think we have a huge obligation to certainly the Afghan refugees, those who worked for the military services. It's really inexcusable what we've done. And I think one of the things that the Biden administration did early on was the Ukrainian, when things happen in Ukraine, they quickly made some policy changes that streamline the process for Ukrainians to enter the country. And I think we have an obligation to do that for the Afghanis to the extent we can.
Yeah. And one other thing I just want to mention, and I welcome anybody to respond to this, and Daniel sort of got to this a little bit. USCIS by statute is supposed to fund itself from the fees that applicants pay for their services. But there are some kinds of cases, notably refugee processing, asylum processing, some types of humanitarian parole, that we don't charge fees for, but we ask everyone else to pay more for their cases to cover those cases. But we've seen those kind of cases grow substantially. I know that, for example, both in the Afghan parole programs and the Uniting for Ukraine, one of the things the government tried to do was require U.S. sponsors who would agree to kind of help support those who were brought in on these parole programs. But I don't think they also had them paying fees. So one of the things we've also written about BPC is whether or not this purely fee-funded model for USCIS can work in the long run. USCIS has actually gotten extraordinary appropriations from Congress a couple of times in the last decade to help try to address the backlogs. They do get appropriations to try to modernize their processing. A lot of the processes are still very paper-based. I'm sure Eleanor has thoughts on that. But we're still kind of really I would say in the 80s or the early 90s in how we do these things. So I've just opened it up to the panelists if anybody has thoughts about, how much of this, we talked about both the processing backlog, we talked about the CAP backlog, how much of this is about how USCIS is funded, and anybody want to, I'll ask Eleanor first to kind of talk from her perspective about the fees.
That's a very big question. Yes, I think that I agree with Daniel that USCIS is underfunded and under-resourced. I'm not sure how I feel about expanding premium processing as the answer to that. On the one hand, yes, I mean, if you expand premium processing, USCIS makes more money and more people have to get their cases resolved within a finite time frame. On the other hand, basically, the cost of a transaction with USCIS essentially goes up, because if the choice is between having my case premium processed and getting an answer and never ever getting an answer, then basically what you've done by expanding premium processing is you've de facto raised the fees. That's basically what it is. It's a fee increase. So I know for my clients, for companies, they look at premium processing as a cost of doing business, and there is some resentment when the only way you can actually really do business is by paying that premium processing fee. So I think that's a little bit problematic, but it is true that USCIS it does need more resources, but they also need to sit down and figure out ways to work smarter. I agree with Daniel that there are situations where they should not need to produce a card or adjudicate an application to grant interim benefits like employment authorization and special travel permissions. So those are ways of working more efficiently.
I'll add to that. obviously, yeah, I think it's effectively a fee increase, but unlike fee increases, it bounds the time of response, right? And I would rather have a fee increase that bounds the time of response than one that doesn't, like what we're actually seeing now, because they've increased fees in real terms, even though the service is getting worse. And so I think that that's outrageous. And my concern with congressional funding is that we're asking taxpayers now for support. And that's not a good way to build support for legal immigration in the United States.
That it's an investment in our future.
Yeah, but I think taxpayers are going to see it as now we're going to have to pay money to bring in immigrants to the United States when immigrants are more than happy to pay it themselves if that means those cases will get decided. So, yeah, it's a political question.
We are at time. I want to thank all of our panelists. I want to thank Jack and Madeline and Daniel and Eleanor. Please, you can look up all of these people on the internet. They have a wonderful amount of expertise and insights and ideas. I thank you all for contributing them to our webinar today. I thank you for watching. And once again, you're welcome to find this report and all of our other work at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. We hope you will join us for another event soon.